I presented some processes, some ideas in the past. These have ranged from things I strongly believe in and have used for years and years, like triage, to things that I believed in and used but still needed some refinement, like Dragon Age Week, to things that were still works in progress, like the Hourglass. This goes beyond that. This is something that I want to work. This is something that I dream about working, but it might not actually be possible. I'm talking about a universal backlog. For those of you who don't know, in Agile, a backlog is where tasks and features live so that they can be pulled off and worked on in different milestones, in different sprints. The idea of a universal backlog is you have a common set of features, a common set of deliverables that's accessible to as wide of an audience as possible. This backlog contains only things that are not required by a game or games, but are nice to haves. These might be new bits of features, new bits of content, new tools, new pipelines. And the idea is you keep this backlog accessible, and then when people are done the task that they are officially assigned, they can go into this backlog and pluck a thing off to work on. And then when they're done, that gets added to their game or possibly another game, making everything a little bit better. Already, some of you are thinking, I don't know that that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, there are some problems with it that I haven't fully figured out. But let's walk through how this might be able to work. First of all, we need to start with some assumptions. We have to assume that everything on this backlog has been vetted by someone, such that if there is a deliverable for a project, it has been vetted in such a way by the person in authority on the project it relates to, such that the cost of delivering that feature is accommodated. Adding something to a game is always going to have some degree of cost beyond the actual work required to deliver it. Costs like testing that content or localizing things if it includes words, making sure it fits on the disk. Let's assume that everything on this backlog is desirable enough that you're willing to eat those costs. Additionally, all the required standards required for delivering things are clear enough that even someone who doesn't normally do this kind of work can understand them and follow them. This might be a big ask, but it means that if I'm a non-programmer and I decide to pull a programming task off of this universal backlog, I'm able to follow the coding standard well enough that whatever code I write would be accepted into the code base. If I'm making a piece of art, I understand the art direction well enough to make a piece of art that's at least pretty close to the expected art direction. I understand the number of polygons I'm allowed to put in a chair. I understand the expectation of texture resolutions. All of these things are clear enough that even if I'm not typically doing this kind of work, if I work in this area, I can still follow the standards. So now you might be starting to feel like, okay, I now start to understand why this might be really difficult to actually do. If I make something, we need to assume that there is some kind of approval process in place that allows these to be approved or declined before they are integrated into the main line of the project that this belongs to. We don't want this lower priority, nice to have content being worked on by non-standard devs being just shoved into the main line willy-nilly. We need some kind of isolation such that if I'm making a whole bunch of goofy hats, they are going into a branch or another repository to be approved before they are integrated into the main line. And finally, this isn't a requirement, but it would be really nice if we had some sort of content repository with some kind of really well thought out tagging, such that as this content, as these features are created, they are available to be searched and found, so that if I'm thinking I want to make a hat and I want to put a feather on it, I have some way that I can say, hey, do we already have a model of a feather? And I can find that relatively easily. You might think that's obvious. Of course, your project is going to have this. But two things. One, ideally, this would go beyond an individual project. Ideally, your entire organization would be aware of all the content that exists across all of the projects within the organization. And as far as I know, I don't think any of the large video game publishers have anything that looks like that. But even within a project, often this kind of cataloging isn't done super effectively. At the beginning of Joplin, there was an audit done of idle animations, and across the history of BioWare, we found 34, 35 different idle animations. BioWare has not made 34 or 35 games, so why did we have this many different idle animations? And these weren't unique idle animations designed for individual people. They were just the standard BioWare weight shifting idle animation. So some form of cataloging, some form of indexing would be immensely helpful, because it means that this content is more accessible to other people who are trying to pluck things off this universal backlog. So let's talk about the kinds of things that you could put on this universal backlog. The easiest would be atomic deliverables. These are deliverables that are small enough or isolated enough to be done and integrated by a single person. So this could be a static prop. This could be a piece of artwork that you're going to stick on the wall in a level. This could be a codex entry. The reality is that a lot of things you might think are atomic aren't, because they often have other dependencies beyond the thing you immediately think of. Rather than being atomic, they're what I'm going to call near atomic. So most of the work is isolated to the work you think of, but then there's a few small things kind of glued onto the side. If you're going to make a hat that you can wear in the game, most of the work goes into the modeling and texturing of the hat. But you're also going to have some other things. You're going to need an icon that shows up in your inventory. You're going to need a description so people understand what this hat is, or at least a name. It may be possible to turn these near atomic tasks into atomic tasks by front loading some of those attached tasks. You might say, well, we're going to want a lot of hats for our game. So I'm going to just come up with a big list of approved names and put those approved names into the universal backlog and say, make a squirrel hat. And I've attached the icon and I've attached the name. So now someone just needs to come along and do that atomic piece of work of actually modeling and texturing the hat. Or alternatively, you might be able to automate some of this stuff. Maybe the icon is simply an automatically generated screenshot of the 3D model. So you might be able to move things from this near atomic space into the atomic space. As we move more complicated than this near atomic space, we're going to get to molecules. These require a couple of different skill sets in order to deliver. If I'm going to reskin a creature, I'm going to do some modeling work. It's going to need to be reskinned. It's going to need new textures, new materials. As we've gotten into more and more specialized skill sets, the kind of tasks that are molecules is actually increased, because in the past, one creature artist would have done all of the things I just said. These days, that could be 2, 3, even 4 people. As we get into this kind of task, into this kind of deliverable, the approvals are also going to be more complicated. And often you're getting into the kinds of things that are going to require some degree of iteration. Here, we might start to cross between different departments as well. If I want a new weapon, then I'm going to need a model. I might restrict myself to work within the existing animation system, but I'm going to probably need some additional design. So I'm going to at least need art and design, possibly also animation. As we move up in complexity, we're starting to get more departments, more requirements coming online. As we get even more complicated, we need more and more individual skill sets. So if we want to make a brand new creature, what do we need? We need a model. We need it to be rigged. We need it to be skinned. We need animation. We need to give it an AI behavior. We need to give it abilities. We need to figure out where it fits in the ecosystem. We probably need to write a backstory for it and give it a name. We're starting to draw in more and more and more different departments. As we get to this level, it stops making sense that you're going to expect a person or people to pull the entire thing off of the backlog and do it as a single unit. If you're doing a reskin of a creature, me and my tech anim buddy might be able to work together and pull that thing off and do it as a single unit. Even though it's not atomic, we might be able to almost treat it as atomic. As we get to this level of complexity, that's unlikely to work. So now we need our backlog to be able to handle things moving through these various phases, gathering different bits of their overall system over potentially a really long period of time across a really wide group of people that potentially aren't really communicating with each other. If I want a new creature and I put make a new creature on the backlog, and let's assume that I'm super clear as to what a new creature entails, then the concept of universal backlog means that at some point, someone has some extra work and they're pulling something off and they say, okay, right, we're going to make a new lizard creature and I'm going to model up a lizard. And then I'm going to mark that as done and attach it to that overarching deliverable. And then sometime later, maybe months, maybe years, someone else is going to come down and say, okay, we've got this lizard model. It needs to be rigged. And I'm going to rig it and I'm going to put it back on. And then someone's going to come and animate it. Someone's going to design the combat behaviors. And that means that the typical way that content moves through your system may not be what happens here. Things are being done very piecemeal by very different people over a very long period of time. So when you put things this complicated onto your backlog, there needs to be logical stopping points such that people can take something off, do a little bit of work, and then put it back on, knowing that they may not be the person to take that back off the shelf the next time. You may see another advantage to having really clear content cataloging in your system as well. If there is a complex task on the universal backlog to build a new creature, and I'm a character modeler and I want to make a lizard creature, if I know what already exists, there exists the possibility that I might be able to kit bash together some of the parts that I can't do myself. Maybe I'm not making new abilities, but maybe I'm able to take the bite ability from the wolf and lay it on top of my lizard creature. By understanding what already exists, you introduce the possibility for some of these tasks to be completed by combining existing elements with new elements. Does this allow you to render some of these things atomic? Probably not. If you're making a new lizard creature, there's still probably a modeling and rigging and skinning and animating tasks, but some of them might be able to be offloaded by salvaging what already exists. In some cases, these complicated deliverables are actually a bunch of the same deliverable over and over again. If I want to make a new subclass, one of the major bits of work required for a new subclass is a whole bunch of abilities. Maybe I need 25 abilities to make a new subclass. So I can ask for a new subclass. We're going to make a new warrior subclass. We need 25 abilities. And now what we have is the ability for people to take individual bits of that polymer off and then plug them back in as things are delivered. But again, we need a very clear workflow such that we can track what we have along the way. In the case of something like a new subclass, until we get to 25 abilities, we may have nothing. Our game may require that a subclass have 25 abilities. And when we have 22 abilities, we don't have a subclass. So we have a collection of content, a collection of deliverables that we can't actually do anything with until we get up to that 25th ability. This is why we need a really clean way to contain and control this content so that it can sit outside of the main line of the game development. Because again, these are nice to have deliverables, nice to have features. So there's a reasonable chance that we're never going to get to 25 abilities. We might just get a few abilities that we never are able to do anything with. And then this is the sort of dream one, the most complicated thing of all. What if we put something like port Dragon Age Origins to the PS5 on our backlog? How does that work? Can we make that work? Can we break that task down into some accomplishable things along the way, like make it compile for the PS5, update it to the newest version of DirectX, make it a 64-bit executable as opposed to a 32-bit executable? The problem with these incredibly large things, and I think the Polymer has a similar problem, is that there is an inherent stealth deliverable, which is actually just breaking this down into something manageable. But there's something really compelling at this level as you imagine some of these things that can slowly work their way through an organization where otherwise they would just never be done. Things like modernization of games that exist in the back catalog, not full remasters or remakes, but the ability to just modernize something that exists in your back catalog, making it compile on new hardware, making it turn on when otherwise the game might just die and disappear into the backlog. Are you going to ship these things? You could. Having a version of Dragon Age Origins that runs on a PS5 is valuable to some degree, even if you do nothing other than just make it run. But the other thing that also this can be used for is as the wedge that allows you to argue to do the more amount of work. If you have a version of Dragon Age Origins that runs on a PS5, now it becomes easier to say, well, we can spend a little bit of money and do a light remaster. We can spend more money and do a heavier remaster. The game already runs on this target platform, so it feels like a lot of the heavy lifting has already been done. The reality is making it turn on the target platform is probably amongst the least amount of work, but there's a big emotional impact to being able to turn the thing on and then talk about what you could do that is more. If you're with me so far, if you're on board with this crazy idea, how wide do we go? Within a single project, this is really what I've talked about in the past. This is Dragon Age Week. This is Google Free Time with just a little bit more structure. You're letting people do work beyond their typical work in available time. You're just putting a bunch of structure on it. This is the easiest because chances are you already have a standardized art direction and standardized coding practices. And the people that are most likely to work within a certain area are at least going to be familiar with your expectations of performance or your texel densities or whatever. As we move up to the studio level, we start to see more possibilities because now you have people able to work on other projects within the studio as they come free, as they have extra cycles in their day, their week, their month. But now we start to run into divergences because maybe the coding standards have diverged between the two projects within a studio, or maybe you are using two different engines and my ability to pull something off the Unreal backlog when I've been working in Frostbite might be very restricted. So we start to see that this works better if we start to standardize on some things. If we can standardize on a single engine, if we can standardize on a single coding standard. We can't standardize on art direction. We can't standardize exactly our performance expectations because the games are going to be different. But if we can start to lock down a few things, it becomes easier for people to move within the organization and pluck things off as they have free cycles. And that brings us to the dream. The dream would be to have this universal backlog contain deliverables from all of the projects within your giant 9,000 person organization. And people can work on things across the entire organization. If you're EA, if you're Activision, if you're Ubisoft, you often have big groups of people who are idle at any one moment. Being able to give them interesting work to work on keeps their skills sharp and potentially allows you to do a lot more. But of course, this requires a degree of coordination that I've never seen within any of these larger organizations. It requires a commonality of code base. Not necessarily identical code, but at least a commonality so people are familiar with where they're working. Your asset repositories need to be similar to each other so that I can understand how to work within your repository when I've never seen it before. It even just requires a commonality of how we write down tasks and where they put them so that we can all share this common backlog. There's a whole bunch of things you would have to do to make this work. But if you could make it work, it could unlock a significant amount of additional polish and experimentation that is being lost inside of the machinery right now. Any of you who've worked in any kind of role that involves a lot of organization, anyone who's done any project management, this entire presentation is probably making you incredibly itchy. And I kind of think that maybe it should, because I've flirted with this in the past, but as is probably fairly obvious, the burden of actually making this work is actually ginormous. And it requires a organizational commitment that is just not there in any organization I've interacted with. The other thing is that it is certainly plausible that there are unintended consequences of starting that process. In order to make this possible, you might need to impose a degree of sameness across your organization that ends up starving out creativity that otherwise might be able to flourish. I don't know that I actually believe that, but it's certainly an argument that I think you could make. As you force everyone into enough of a common framework, enough of a common scaffolding such that you could have a universal backlog, maybe that in and of itself has such a bad side effect that the consequence of doing this isn't worth the benefits that you might get. So I released this idea to the universe because I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get it off the ground, at least at a large scale. So if you work in an organization, go ahead and do this or try it if you want. If you work at an organization that already does something like this, share it down in the comments because I'd love to have a conversation about the problems and benefits of something this ambitious. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're more comfortable in supporting the channel that way. Both Patreon supporters and channel members get access to our Discord, which is a great way to interact with our community to a greater degree. This one is something that I want to work, but I do recognize might be impossible, might just be this bit of utopian nonsense that simply cannot work in any practical way. But if you have ideas, if you've seen it working, definitely share that with me down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.